Hello, this is Glynn Tonsor. I'm a faculty member of the Department of Agriculture Economics at Kansas State University. I'm making this recording titled Economic Aspects of Limit Feeding for the Stocker Field Day event, which normally occurs in person in the fall here in Manhattan, Kansas, and is being done virtually this year. Presentation is actually done jointly with Claudia Song, which is a master's student pursuing her graduate degree here at K-State. And she's been working with myself and Dale Blasi and some others on this topic, and we're going to share some of our results here today. Before I go any further, I want to give credit where it's due. Aspects of this project have been supported by a National Cattlemen's Beef Association research grant with K-State. Dr. Blasi led that effort. Myself and others are collaborators on it. You can see the grant number here, and I will acknowledge that funding support. As quick, broader background to kind of set the stage for this discussion, I think most of us are aware there's ongoing questions and calls for documenting production practices and at times calls for change. Some of that, and more recently, a higher share of those calls have fallen under the bucket of sustainability. We've probably seen the term sustainable production, sustainability in more ways in the media in the last 3 years than in the past. And that is of note. The beef cattle industry is not the only food segment that's dealing with that, but it's important to recognize there's a lot of questions that come up sustainability to me, and as it relates to the beef cattle industry. I'm not a life cycle, expert. I'm not a definitions expert, and I get concerned about, I shouldn't say I'm concerned, is I always pause and say, what do you mean by sustainability? Because it's not a standardized term. So it's not standardized like USD organic, for example. So sustainability means a lot of different things to different people. In my eyes, sustainability usually involves resource use, impact on the environment, and economic viability. Those are certainly components, probably not a complete list, but those certainly are components of the sustainability discussion. And it won't surprise you as an economist, I think economists have a role in that discussion, speaking to economic viability. For the specific production practice decision today that we're going to talk about, which is limit feeding of beef cattle, we're going to hone in on the decision about whether to limit feed, which is just constrain the amount and the type of feed that are available to, in our case, stockers, and more generally the stocker backgrounder segment of the beef cattle industry, and compare that with an ad lib, so eat all you want kind of approach. There's a lot of considerations that go into that decision about what feeding practice to use. You've already heard some about that. How is animal performance impacted? How do you need to change the ration? Does it change the labor involvement? There's a lot of physical components, both for the operator, the land, and the cattle, that certainly have a role here. And at the end of the day, my job, Claudia, and others that are trying to contribute insights on the economic front need to add into the economic assessment piece of this. So this isn't all inclusive, but economics are a key piece of that decision, and we're going to try to enhance decisions by providing some of those related economic insights. So Claudia's master's thesis here at K-State is ongoing. You're going to see some of the outputs we have in hand, and I'm going to allude to some of the things that are still in process. One of the biggest things we're going to talk about today is some Excel-based decision tools that she's built to hopefully help cattle producers make better decisions as it relates to the merits of limit feeding on their operation. She's done this separately for the stocker segment and the feedlot segment, and you'll see why here in a few moments. Multiple resources came from this. In the spirit of a lot of other decision aids that you'd find on our agmanager.info website, these were designed where several inputs can be adjusted, and Claudia's going to walk through that for you here in a moment, and they hone in on a bottom line decision. In this case, limit feed versus ad lib, what's the projected net margin difference between those two practices? That's what drives this entire effort. Also, and outside of the NCBA funded work, I actually had the opportunity with Claudia and another master student, Megan Brentz, had a related project that again involves the stocker segment and different feeding systems, intensive feeding systems that is. We looked at some feedback we got from a national survey. So we had the opportunity to do a survey in April and May with the help of others. And I'm going to give you some initial insights of some of that ongoing work as well. So here's a picture of Claudia. I wish we were sitting in front of you in person. I enjoy every year, September, early October, going out to the stocker field unit and having this in person. You would have the pleasure of seeing Claudia and I in person as a normal year, but you're going to have to settle for a virtual audio recorded version, and you're going to hear from her in a moment. I've put a screen picture here of a recent addition to our agmanager.info website, and you can see there's multiple entries. Middle of September, these were made. And these are different links to these Excel-based decision tools I just alluded to. With them are actually word-based fact sheets kind of talk you through it, so to speak, in writing. And then what I really want to call your attention to is the bottom here. You can see there's a movie clip, and it's an MP4 file, roughly 20 minutes long, that Claudia's built. That's basically a tutorial of how to use the Stocker segment decision tool. In a few minutes, I'm going to play a few clips of that, partly to bait you to watch the whole thing, but also to hone in on some of the key points of these decision tools. Before I do that, I want to strongly encourage any of you that operate in the Stocker segment to make use of these tools. We're going to share base information. I encourage you to tailor it to yours. That's the whole point of these resources. I hope you find her tutorial helpful in doing that.
A research study was conducted at the Kansas State University Stocker Unit to evaluate the impacts of limit feeding during the backgrounding phase and to develop an economic framework to measure and quantify the sustainable attributes of limit feeding. Throughout the research trial, 418 calves were allotted to 2 treatments. One was a higher energy diet that was limit fed, and the other treatment was a lower energy diet that was fed ad libitum, so as much as the calf would eat. Those limit fed calves were restricted to about 85% of the intake of the ad libitum fed calves, and then throughout the trial, performance data, tractor and mixer usage and delivery time, and health data was collected throughout the trial. And then all of those variables were utilized to build producer budget sheets that compare the cost of each feeding type in the diets fed. These budget sheets are built off of the research conducted at the Stocker unit, but also allows and encourages producers to input their own operation costs as well, so it's representative for their operation. The budget sheet is designed to serve as a barometer to compare the profitability for the backgrounding or stocker sector, to compare the cost and benefits of growing stocker calves through limit feeding or ad lib feeding those cattle. The budget sheets are not intended to represent any one operation, and each individual should input key inputs to reflect their own operation. Those values that are designed to be adjusted for specific operations are denoted in blue. So there are default values in place. Those defaults came through either the research at the Stocker unit or through KFMA values or other research. So there are default values in there, but if it's a blue value, we highly encourage you to go through your records and input those costs specific to your operation. And then the black values are automatically calculated through formulas or other research, and they should not be adjusted. And then there's a feed tab, which I'll show you here in a second, which is the diets utilized throughout the research. If you choose to use a diet other than the diets provided, you can update that information accordingly, and it will update within the respective sheet. So here within the introduction, it just gives you some definitions of what each value represents. So as you're going through your records, thinking through where does this cost get accounted for at, different things like that, and also explains how we got the values that we did. So that's the production efficiency information up at the top. Then it goes into gross returns, variable cost, accounting for different costs, and then the fixed cost at the bottom. So to begin, we'll just head over to the feed tab. So here at the top, we have the ad libitum fed diet. So this is the diet, the lower energy diet that was fed for as much as the cattle would eat. So it shows you the ingredient breakdown for the pounds per head per day, the cost per pound for that ingredient, and then finally at the bottom, the total cost per head per day. Again, if you are feeding a different diet, you should update this accordingly and making sure those costs are on a per head basis. And then at the bottom, we have the limit fed diet, so the diet that was restricted and fed at and was a higher energy diet. So you can see the ingredient breakdown from the research trial and the cost per pound, and then ultimately the cost per head per day. So once we have that updated, I'm going to go through a producer example. For example, if someone was sitting across from me and we were thinking about this for their operation. To begin, we'll go through the ad libitum sheet first, so putting in the information that we found throughout the research trial and also inputting those variables that represent each operation into that, and then we'll repeat the process for limit-fed cattle. So to begin, we go up here to the top section, which is our production efficiency information. So I'll just go through an example and show you what values you input and how kind of the spreadsheet works, and ultimately how we interpret the results. So to begin, we'll start with death loss. So for this example, the producer has a death loss of about 1.5%. So we change that. They typically background their cattle for 150 days. And they typically manage for an average daily gain of 2.5 pounds. You can see as we change these values, a lot of the black values are updating as they are formulas that we've set up so they read off of those values that producers change. So we see our hundredweight produce is updated, and then we go into our gross return section. Our feeder animal sale price is based upon the default price is a March steer price, and then the purchase price, this down here, is the default is based upon an October steer price. So you'll want to be sure you are updating those prices based on the time of year you're purchasing cattle, or if you're purchasing heifers, just be aware of that those prices can change and you should be updating those for seasonality and the type of cattle you're purchasing. So we'll leave that for this example, and then you'll also want to update the weight that you typically purchase those cattle at. So for this example, they typically purchase them at 550 pounds. Update that, and then you'll see that this value changed once we updated that. So that was a formula that doesn't need to be touched, but it is going to update based off of those inputs. So that brings us to our total gross return of $377.55 per head. So then we'll move into variable cost. So the first three lines are all about pasture, crops, harvested forage. So if you're utilizing those resources to background cattle, you'll want to input values there. For this example, the producer doesn't utilize those. They bunk feed and their cattle are on a lot, so we'll just leave those zeroed out. And then we have the grain, protein, and mineral supplement cost. This feed cost here is, it comes off of the feed tab. So it's directly right into there, so you don't have to update that. It pulls it itself, and then it's multiplied by the days in the backgrounding lot and gives us a feed cost of $154.59 per head for that calf while they're in the backgrounding phase. Then if a producer has any other feed costs, they can include those here. And then the labor wage. So for this example, they have a labor wage of $17, and it's multiplied by a value that was found through previous research that is the labor requirement for stocker cattle. So that gives us a labor cost of $25.50. And then next we have the average precipitation events. So you want to think about the climate that you are raising these cattle in. If you're getting a lot of rain, it's going to require more labor as you're having to clean out those bunks and different things like that. So this producer is estimating about 3 rain events. So we'll input that, and it updates our cost. And then next we have the mix and delivery time of the diets. So as I mentioned in the research, they recorded the times that it took to mix the diets and also to deliver those diets. as we're feeding 2 different diets and feeding them at 2 different volumes, we expect our labor requirement to change. So we update our labor wage here, and then this 0.813 was found through the research, and that's our time that it took to limit feed those cattle. So the limit feeding took a little bit less time to feed. So down here, we have the anticipated increase in time to feed those cattle if we're feeding that ad libitum diet, which is understandable as we are feeding that diet at a higher volume, and also the diet was more forage based, so it was a little bit drier and more stemmier, so it took more time to deliver that. So then that's all calculated together and gives us a cost of $21.96 to mix and deliver feed to that calf throughout the backgrounding period. And then we have our vet medicine costs. So going through the records, this producer found that their vet medicine drug cost is about $9. So we'll change that. Their marketing costs are $10.50. Their utilities, gas, fuel, and oil is $4. And then the manure management cost or revenue. So if you're selling your manure to someone, or if you have to pay someone to come in and clean out your manure and dispose of it, you'll account for that cost here. This producer doesn't have that, so we'll just leave it blank. And then machine, facility, equipment, and repairs. The producer doesn't have this information, so we're just going to utilize the default KFMA value that is presented there. And then we have the tractor mixer time and usage. So this accounts for the cost that it takes to utilize that equipment. So this $46 is the lease cost for the tractor and the mixer, multiplied by the limit fed timing, and then the feedings per day. But again, with the ad libitum, we're expecting a little bit more time, so you're increasing those hours spent. So we have that accounted for, giving us a lease cost of $59.43 per head. And then the final two within the variable costs is cash interest paid and other variable cost utilizing the KFMA values that were provided. And then that brings our total variable costs to $304.72 per head. Total fixed cost to $27. So when we add our variable cost and our fixed cost together, giving us a total cost of $331.72 per head. And then finally, we have our income over variable cost of $72.82 per head, and an income over total cost of $45.82 per head. So that's for if we would ad libitum feed those back stocker cattle, and then we just go over to the limit fed sheet and repeat the process, and then compare the two income over total cost just to gauge that profitability and make our decision for our operation. When we look at the summary tab, we have all of the total gross return, total variable cost, total fixed cost, income over variable cost, and our income over total cost for ad libitum feeding and limit feeding, and then the difference between the two. So the key thing that producers want to look at here is the difference between our income over total cost for the two feeding types. We see that limit feeding provides more profit for this specific example and this producer than the ad lib feeding at $45.82 compared to limit feeding at $123.44 per head, a difference of $77.62. So for this specific example, we see that it is more profitable for a producer to limit feed given the input costs and their feed costs and the feed ingredients and their labor wage and all those values that we input. We get a better idea of that profitability, and then the producer can make a decision for their operation, weighing all of the costs and benefits.
Hope you found those comments from Claudia helpful. As I said, I encourage you to watch the full 20-minute. I'm in the spirit of time and just kind of keeping this presentation focused. I'm just using some snippets from that. So please watch the whole thing. One of the things I want to impress on you is the net benefit for limit feeding is very operation specific. That won't surprise you when I tell you that. You need to use those decision tools to tailor the numbers for your own situation. But that said, it is my job to kind of provide broad context about what are some of the net benefits that we think apply. So I'm going to do that here for a few minutes. So for the stocker segment, limit feeding versus ad lib appears to have multiple benefits. You heard Dr. Blasi earlier talk about some of the production and the feed usage benefits. Those, when we put them into our decision tool, the budget comparison, we see we have higher projected gross returns, primarily because you're going to sell a heavier animal, and you have lower cost, primarily variable cost because of lower feed cost. Well, if you have a boost in revenue and a decline in cost, that is advantageous to profits. And in our base default situation, that corresponds with about a $46 per steer per head in your system profit gain. Now, to drive my point home about sensitivity for your own operation, some of you probably picked up when Claudia was going through, she actually came up with more about a $70 difference or a benefit to limit feeding, given the scenarios that she was walking through. I think it's important to recognize that limit feeding versus ad lib may not be a no-brainer for all operations all the time. Even if you're in a situation to where the net benefit is small under normal operation times, maybe normal rainfall, normal forage cost and availability, so forth, one can quickly envision a drought situation, or maybe you just regionally happen to be in an area where feed availability and forage availability is reduced for whatever reason that might be, to where now it makes sense for you to consider limit feeding. One of the appeals of this is a large part of this could be adjusted over time. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing all the time. And to that point, I encourage you to periodically come back and use these decision tools. And you may find that what was once a small net benefit that may not have encouraged you to change has actually grown over time. So please keep that in mind. As for some preliminary insights from the survey work, and again, this is an ongoing effort. We conducted the survey in April and May. Quick shout out to Beef and Inform and Engage, their research arm. They helped us do this mail survey, nationally representative of the cattle sector, specifically the stocker segment is what we were targeting. Doing that during kind of the heart of COVID was no small task. So thank you for our collaborators there for helping pull that off. And there's several things we hope to gain from that survey data. We intend to document kind of base practices and views. I'm going to give you a couple flavor statistics on that in a second. And ultimately, we hope to shed light on base preferences for limit feeding and ad lib, how changes in cost, for example, will alter people's choices, how changes in average daily gain in one system would change their preferences. That's where Claudia and I are going in our thesis more deeply. At this point in time, we don't have those specific results to share. Look for those posted on Ag Manager, and I'm sure Dale will work with us to post them on ksubeef.org in the future. A couple things to note here. The base, just kind of raw data summaries. 43% of our respondents suggest they currently limit feed. So this isn't new in the sense that there are limit feeding exercises at play. There's different ways to change the ration and maybe tighten it down to even more limiting. I mean, there's really a continuum, I think, in my mind, of limit feeding versus ad lib. Dale and others could speak to that more completely. But it is noteworthy that maybe close to half the industry is doing some version of limit feeding currently, but not everybody. So of those that said they're not limit feeding, I think it's a little bit interesting to take note of some of the comments they provided. The first two I noted here, initial cost and labor, might speak to cost side concerns or viability concerns for their operation of going limit feeding. Those may not be accurate, but that's what's in the mind of those participants and producers when they responded. I put four other ones here that have components about my forage availability and my production system in mind. Maybe to paraphrase, I don't need it, is kind of what's in the mind here. Maybe those are operations that have quote unquote excess forage or lower cost forage available in most cases and aren't as motivated to pursue a limit feeding practice. And for those operations, that might make sense. I'm not sitting here saying it doesn't. But even for those operations, certainly over time, forage and feedstuff availability can change. Drought conditions and other things like that can change. So even if you don't make a permanent adjustment, I encourage you to hear us out and be aware of these decision tools if you find yourself in that situation. And at the bottom, I included, one producer did respond saying it does not work, suggesting they've tried limit feeding and it didn't work for them. Maybe they had an adverse animal performance impact. Who knows what that would be. This is a big industry with lots of different participants, lots of animals in this industry, and you certainly are going to have some that adopt something that doesn't work as expected. So that doesn't surprise me. I hope that producer learns from that, maybe tweaks it, and if it's limit feeding or something like in the future, they learn and benefit from that experience. So what are some take-home economic points from this? On balance, I do think there's evidence that stocker operators can benefit from moving from ad lib towards limit feeding. Some of the core benefits that showed up in the stocker trials that Dale and his team, Morgan and others that you've heard from and get to hear from in other venues, point to higher average daily gain for cattle that are in a limit feed setting, and point to improved feed efficiencies. Those speak well to the potential sustainability benefits for this sector of additional adoption of limit feeding. Our Excel-based decision tools peg that as a net value of about $45, $46 per steer for those that adopt limit feeding versus ad lib. Now, hopefully you heard me loud and clear, and that's why I put an underline here. I strongly encourage you to use our Excel-based decision tools to refine that number. For some of you, it may be closer to $70, like Claudia's walkthrough example came to. For others, it might be closer to an indifferent zero or potentially even a negative, depending on your situation. So please use those decision tools to refine your own assessment and ultimate decision. I will also note the first round of trials that were done at the stocker unit, Dale and his team were able to work with prep feeders. So those animals went from the stocker unit eventually to prep feeders and subsequently harvested. Gave us the opportunity to track some feedlot performance, gave Claudia information to parameterize feedlot parallel decision tools to what she spoke to earlier and what I highlighted are now on our Ag Manager website. Initial look there is that actually at the feedlot level, cattle that were limit fed during the stocker phase don't perform as well. So there may actually be some detrimental effects in the feedlot segment. I think that's worth additional consideration, additional research in the future. So what is the net impact for the industry is a slightly different question than what might be best for a given producer. And that isn't inconsistent, so hear me out for a moment. The net industry impacts or aggregate for the industry are going to reflect the total percentage of cattle that are in a limit feed setting at the stocker backgrading phase and what the business relationship for the rest of the industry is. So for example, if you have a stocker operation who limit feeds and sells a local auction market where there's very limited information transfer and available for potential buyers, those buyers are buying cattle in a realm of uncertainty, not knowing if they're limit feeding or ad lib feeding or something else was at play. In that context, a feedlot is not going to have the information to make a distinction. The seller from the stocker enterprise is probably not going to get a premium nor a discount for that, and they're going to internalize those on their operation benefits of higher average daily gain, feed efficiency, so forth. Conversely, if you have a relationship where maybe you directly sell to a feed yard, and that's a repeat business relationship, over time, they're going to learn, and I suggest you communicate what is being done, what those limit feeding practices are, and that becomes part of a broader business relationship because you have an ongoing kind of one-to-one relationship, and differences in animal performance that impact on the feedlot side of things is going to be part of that discussion. Moreover, if you have a larger aggregated adoption of limit feeding, we might see increased calls for documenting or requests for that information, sort of akin to animal health information today. So, VAC45 and other kind of claims, whether it's natural, genetic, breed claims, there's a whole suite of things in the feeder cattle marketplace where some people voluntarily make claims in hope of getting a higher price. You could also see a situation in the future where cattle buyers, in this case feedlots, might seek more information about whether limit feeding was in place or not at the last spot in the life of those animals. We could see that part of the marketplace mature as well, and that will have an impact on the net industry-wide effects of this. So look for those adjustments over time if this practice is adopted further. At this point in time, we see some positives for the stocker segment, some detrimental effects it looks like for the feedlot segment, and what the net of that means for the industry is largely to be determined by those bigger kind of industry-wide, industry relationship, macroeconomic-oriented functions that I'm trying to allude to here. Thank you for your time. I hope you have found this useful. I look forward to, hopefully this next year, we're in person for Stocker Field Day again. I will end by saying there will be a PDF of these slides posted on our Ag Manager website. Here's the specific link for quote unquote my homepage. You can find this and a lot of other related information there. We put PDFs of these kind of presentations there. links to the decision tools I alluded to are from there. Things along those lines I hope you find helpful. Thank you for your time.